Scheduled day today. We will have colleagues coming in all through the morning, and so what I've told Senator Inhofe is that we would keep the record open when they come in at appropriate time. They could either put their statement in the record or give their statement. We'll hold all statements to 5 minutes, and that includes all of our panelists as well. I want to thank you all for coming. The other issue is, and I've spoken to Senator Inhofe about this as well, I have to be briefly running down to give a statement on behalf of a bill I have to create or add on to a marine sanctuary in California. At the moment I have to do that, I will have to recess and come right back. So it's a little bit of a marathon type of day for me. So thank you for your understanding. So we'll start the clock at 5 minutes. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency is working on a public relations campaign telling us this week that we should celebrate National Drinking Water Week. And this chart, I guess, is off their website. Is that right? Celebrate National Drinking Water Week. Great. It is great because when Congress passed the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and all the landmark laws, it was a moment in history that we should celebrate every year. However, until EPA sets scientifically based health standards for dangerous tap water contaminants and strictly enforces the law, it's impossible to celebrate this administration's drinking water record. Slogans and PR campaigns are no substitute for action. In fact, today we'll hear about EPA's particularly disturbing failures to address significant risks to our families from two widespread drinking water contaminants, perchlorate and Tce. Perchlorate is used to make rocket fuel, but when it gets into drinking water, this toxic chemical can interfere with the thyroid and affect hormone systems, which control the way the body develops. Infants and pregnant women are especially vulnerable to perchlorate. Researchers have found that over 20 million Americans' drinking water supplies contain perchlorate. GAO found in 2005 that there were nearly 400 sites in 35 states contaminated with perchlorate. My state of California has 106 sites. The evidence of significant exposure to perchlorate and assorted health risks has strengthened in recent years. In 2006, scientists at the CDC found, and I'm quoting the CDC scientists, widespread human exposure to perchlorate, unquote, in the U.S., including in young children. They found many women who were exposed to perchlorate in their drinking water had significant changes in thyroid hormone levels. This isn't a game we're playing. This is the health of the American people. And we know we're exposed to perchlorate from many sources, not just drinking water. A January 2008 study by the FDA found perchlorate in 74% of all foods tested, including baby food. What has the EPA done? The answer, very little. In December 2006, EPA revoked its rule requiring some water systems to monitor for perchlorate and disclose the test results to the public. EPA said it had enough data on perchlorate. It had enough data. It didn't need to have anybody test their drinking water supplies, didn't need to have the public know because EPA had enough data. However, several months later, in May of 2007, EPA said, oh, really, it didn't have enough data on perchlorate exposure, especially from food, to regulate perchlorate in drinking water. So talk about, speaking out of both sides of your mouth. This is a perfect case. We don't need a test anymore. We have enough information, but we can't set a standard because we don't have enough information. Even when many water industry officials, like the American Water Works Association, urged EPA to set a perchlorate standard, EPA refused to do it. Flat out refused. EPA has issued a guidance for perchlorate cleanup, that they've done, but based on this level on a 154-pound adult whose only exposure to perchlorate is from drinking water. Now that is, the way we did it in the past. A 154-pound man. What's safe for him? And they didn't even do that because they said, we're just going to consider the perchlorate from drinking water. This guidance fails to protect children and pregnant women. It fails to consider the fact that people also are exposed to perchlorate in other ways, such as through food and milk. EPA's Children's Health Protection Advisory Committee said the cleanup guidance, quote, is not protective of children's health, is not supported by the underlying science, and can result in exposures that pose neurodevelopment risks in early life. That's EPA's own Children's Health Protection Agency. It's no wonder you hear Bush officials saying, gee, we don't really need that office anymore. The story for TCE is unfortunately very similar. EPA proposed a risk assessment in 2001. It found the chemical could be up to 40 times more toxic than previously thought. In 2002, EPA's Science Advisory Board commended EPA's assessment and urged the agency to proceed with revising and finalizing it. But, according to press accounts, Department of Defense and their contractors and OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, stopped EPA from moving forward, successfully lobbied for a delay and for a National Academy of Sciences report on TCE. Now, in 2006, the National Academy of Sciences found that evidence of TCE's cancer risks had grown since 2001 and recommended EPA finalize risk assessments using currently available data so that cleanups can be made expeditiously. Yet GAO reported last week that EPA will not finalize its TCE assessment until 2010. Where is the EPA? A shadow of its former self, doing harm to people by not acting. Lots of words, no action. While the federal EPA delays or does worse, rolls back safeguards, children and families are exposed to dangerous toxic chemicals. I told EPA last week that if the Bush administration failed to protect our people, Congress will. I have 2 bills to protect people from perchlorate contamination. The first bill, the Perchlorate Monitoring and Right to Know Act, S-24, says EPA is to restore the rule requiring that drinking water be tested for perchlorate and the results of those tests be disclosed to the public. My second bill, the Protecting Pregnant Women and Children from Perchlorate Act, requires EPA to quickly set a perchlorate standard for drinking water that protects pregnant women and children. I wish that everyone who has said in his or her life, our children are our future, or I love my grandchildren more than I love myself, everyone who said that, if everyone who said that forced their elected officials who have said that to act now, it would be the best thing for our country. Senator Clinton, Senator Dole, and myself, and several colleagues also have a bill, the Tce Reduction Act, S-1911, that would protect people exposed to TCE. Congress will not sit idly by while EPA fails to adequately protect our children. Chuck Schumer has a bill to ban bisphenol A. Dianne Feinstein and I had a bill and passed to ban phthalates. So this is what's happening because EPA does nothing. And we must step in to require action that will ensure that our children and our families can turn on their taps and be assured that what comes out is safe to drink. If we can't do that, then shame on us. Senator Barrasso.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. As you say, TCE is a carcinogenic industrial solvent. It has been used to clean engines and rocket motor parts in my home state of Wyoming, primarily by the Department of Defense. Wyoming has had an important legacy to the defense of this country, and nuclear missile silos have been in Wyoming since the early days of the Cold War. Wyoming residents are proud of this legacy, but we also believe that the federal government has a responsibility to leave Wyoming as clean as when they found it. I've raised the issue, Madam Chairman, with the Army Corps of Engineers regarding TCE contamination in the city of Cheyenne's water wells at Belvoir Ranch in Wyoming. This is west of Cheyenne. The Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality believes that this contamination is directly linked to a former nuclear missile site known as Atlas D Missile Site 4. The missile site is currently listed as a formerly utilized defense site. These sites were operational from 1960 to 1965. They were the first generation of intercontinental ballistic missiles armed with nuclear warheads. The Army Corps of Engineers is well aware of TCE leakage from this site. In a letter to me, the Corps amazingly stated that their information does not support the conclusion the missile site is the cause of the water contamination discovered in Cheyenne's nearby wells. The Army Corps suggests, quote, the potential for the existence of other contributing sources, close quote, of the contamination. In the same letter, the Corps announced that they will now be conducting a study to determine whether there is a connection between the missile site and the wells. They will now study the historical TCE use in the area. Well, given the rural, undeveloped terrain of the area in question and the historical fact that TCE was heavily used by the military in the area, it seems clear that the government is needlessly delaying the technical and financial assistance that the city and the state have asked for. This problem has been studied for more than a decade. A major study was initiated in 1995 during the Clinton administration. The map that I have here shows a brown line that shows where the Army Corps believes the TCE is. However, to the right, over here, you can see this dotted line that shows where the city of Cheyenne's water wells are. The series of brown boxes around this area shows where the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality has tested the groundwater. 14 of the brown boxes tested positive for traces of TCE. So this is all tested positive, and this is where the Army Corps says absolutely they realize the TCE plume is moving. Thank you. Given the close proximity of the Atlas missile site to the site, common sense would conclude that there is a connection to the contamination in the city's water wells. Unfortunately, this is not how the federal government works. After additional meetings with the Army Corps of Engineers, I've been informed that additional testing is needed in the area between the city's wells and the missile site to definitively prove that there is a connection. Those tests will be occurring in the next few months, and we will not know the results until the end of the year. The City of Cheyenne and Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality are containing the TCE, but they've been asking the Army Corps for help. It is an expensive process to clean TCE from the water. Currently, that cost is being borne entirely by Wyoming taxpayers. The federal government, through the Army Corps and the EPA, should provide technical and financial assistance sooner rather than later. This situation needs to be resolved quickly for the betterment of Wyoming residents. I look forward to the testimony. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Whitehouse.
Oh, Madam Chair, I'll pass. We can go directly to the testimony.
Senator Bond.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you for holding this hearing today. This hearing allows us to examine the politicization of environmental protection, attempts to roll back environmental law and disregard sound science. Now, some may think that I'm one day early. That's the goal of tomorrow's hearing, as I understand it. However, I'd say that before stones are thrown today, we should examine the glass house some of us are living in today. Part of the purpose of this hearing is to establish the need for a bill currently before the Senate, S-150. That legislation would require EPA to issue regulations on perchlorate levels in drinking water. Sponsors of this legislation are well-meaning, and I have no question about their motives and their concerns. They have the best interests of their constituents at heart, but they fail to acknowledge that their effort is the very definition of political regulation. It is politicians here in the Senate dictating the outcome of EPA's environmental decision-making. And yet, in past months and again tomorrow, these same folks may be trying to tell us that political officials should not tell career scientists and environmental specialists what to do. Their perchlorate bill also represents a rollback of environmental law. Ironically, Congress amended the Safe Drinking Water Act a dozen years ago to get politicians out of the business of deciding which compounds to regulate. The Safe Drinking Water Act now includes a specific process designed to protect public health. The law specifically requires risk assessment and the use of science in decision-making. Under the law, the administrator must present information to the public and conduct a health risk reduction and cost analysis. But advocates would sweep away the environmental law and go straight to the conclusion they favor. Apparently, rolling back environmental laws are okay with them. if and when they choose. This effort also includes a minimization of the work of the National Academy of Sciences. Witnesses will tell us today why we should not follow the natural conclusions of an NAS study on perchlorate. How many times have we heard charges of heeding the advice of political figures instead of peer-reviewed science? Indeed, 2 weeks ago, an NAS study by the National Research Council was heralded when it determined that short-term exposure to ozone is likely to cause premature death in some cases. 2 weeks later, when the NAS is not so helpful, it becomes an inconvenient truth to be minimized or discounted. Now, I agree with the sponsors of this hearing that we must protect the health of women and children from compounds like perchlorate. We must understand the prime pathways perchlorate is getting into the bodies of our infants and children and put a stop to that. Studies indicate the primary route is through baby food, dairy product, and vegetables, and we need to take a hard look at regulating that. But the decision on whether or not to regulate perchlorate in water, as with all of these technical decisions, is best left to the scientific experts, using the processes established by our environmental law. We should not do as some propose and override our environmental law, minimize peer-reviewed science, or act by political fiat. I join with you in welcoming EPA Assistant Administrator Grumbles, and I will have some questions for the record for him. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Senator Bond, at our last hearing, what we learned from the GAO is that indeed there is politics in the risk assessment process. That was what GAO found within EPA, that they are shunting the scientists to the back. And I also want to say, since we will be marking up the 2 perchlorate bills in June, and so we'll have another robust debate at that time,
Good.
I wanted to mention that we don't set any standard. We say follow the science, but act within a certain time frame. So we don't set the standard or put politics in it. We're just trying to put the science back into it and give them a deadline, because in your state and my state, and I could tell you, I know you alluded to it, people are getting very high levels of exposure. We want to see action by the scientists. We want to see a standard set. So,
well, Madam Chair, I wouldn't think you would say that NAS is putting politics in the science.
No. What I said is that.
Well, I know, but I'm referring to the NAS study. And
well,
I
I'm
think
talking
that,
about the GA. I'm reminding you that we had a full hearing on a GAO report that looked at the IRIS system and the way risk assessment is being done, and the fact that EPA is trying to shunt the scientists to the back, put the DOD contractors to the front at the table, and they said it's very dangerous, GAO. And on perchlorate, what I'm saying to you is we do not set a standard. We ask the EPA to act. So I will have that debate.
Based on sound science.
Absolutely. And so I'm going to share that with you and hope maybe to win you over. By the way, working with you on another issue, if you could talk among yourselves for a minute. I'm very proud of the work we're doing on the veterans.
Thank you. That's
okay.
We do have strong bipartisan cooperation.
Yes, we do. I wanted to make
Senator Boxer and I have been working on other things. We may have an occasional disagreement
once in a
or
blue moon.
slight variance here, but we work together
right.
when it comes to taking care of our wounded heroes coming home. Thank you, Madam Chair.
We do, and thank you very much. Mr. Grumbles, we look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's an honor to be here, and EPA truly appreciates the opportunity to discuss our important work on perchlorate and TCE. Madam Chair, since you mentioned it, I do feel it's important to say that the agency strongly supports environmental education, the use of websites, and getting out the word, raising awareness about the importance of source water protection and drinking water protection. But it's not the only effort or the only tool. The regulatory tool is critically important. That's why we're proud that over the last several years we have moved to finalize several nationally significant and important drinking water rules. I would also say, Madam Chairman, that it doesn't take an act of Congress for us. It didn't take an act of Congress for us to make a decision to revise the total coliform rule, which we're working on right now. It didn't take an act of Congress for us to issue a aircraft drinking water rule. And it also didn't take an act of Congress for us to revise the lead and copper rule based on the knowledge we've learned over the last several years. But we share a lot with you and have a lot in common in terms of the goals and using the framework, the regulatory determination process that is set out in the 1996 amendments. We're committed to using the best available science to ensure our policies continue to protect public health and the environment, and we're working with other federal agencies to gather and understand data needed to inform our decision-making. This allows us to share the considerable expertise of other senior government scientists, as well as ensure that each agency's research and analysis benefit from the findings of counterparts who are evaluating similar issues in other agencies. As you know, we also consult with the National Academy of Sciences when we need assistance on evaluating emerging or conflicting scientific issues. With respect to perchlorate, as has been stated, in 2005, the NAS released a report recommending a reference dose. The agency adopted that reference dose. A year later, we issued guidance for contaminated sites, which recommended a revised preliminary remediation goal for perchlorate in water. It was calculated using the reference dose, which was based on the National Academy of Sciences work, and it used standard exposure values of 70 kilograms body weight and 2 liters of water consumed per day. This calculation provides the drinking water equivalent level, assuming no other sources of perchlorate exposure. But we understand, and we've been gathering data that indicates there are other sources of exposure. And Madam Chair, I just want to also underscore the decision we made to not continue regulation of unregulated contaminants, not to continue the monitoring of perchlorate. We never said it's because we had enough data. What we said was we had enough data on occurrence based on the contaminant monitoring rule. We've spent the last several years gathering additional information on relative sources that contribute to the overall determination to make as to whether or not to regulate perchlorate. As you know, we need to know that the contaminant is likely to cause an adverse effect on the health of persons. We know that perchlorate can have an adverse effect, and we're concerned about that. And we have set a reference dose that is based on a more protective, no-effect level, and it's based on the most sensitive subpopulation, which is the fetus of a pregnant woman with iodide deficiency or hypothyroidism. Second, we need to determine if the contaminant is known or likely to occur in public water systems at a frequency and level of public health concern. The results of our regulation for monitoring of unregulated contaminants, such as perchlorate, demonstrated that it was detected at levels above 4 parts per billion in 4% of the public water systems. But we also have to answer the question under the statute of, is there a meaningful opportunity to reduce risks if we issue a new national regulation on perchlorate? We've been spending a lot of time on that, Madam Chairman, and we have been coordinating with other agencies, CDC, and in particular FDA. We find it's very important to have the total diet study from the FDA. It's the most comprehensive effort to date, we believe, on the different sources of contamination and exposure to perchlorate, such as food, not just water. It provides an important additional tool for us to make our determinations. I understand your frustration at how long the process is taking, but we believe it's important to do the work and we intend to issue a final regulatory determination before the end of 2008. With respect to TCE, as you know, it's a different contaminant in that we have already been regulating it. We've been managing the risk in drinking water for many years. Currently, there's a 5 part per billion standard. We began, however, reevaluating the risk assessment for TCE several years ago, and we also, with other agencies, sought additional comments from the Science Advisory Board, and then following up on that from the National Academy of Sciences. Right now, we're evaluating TCE, both in terms of the reevaluating the risk assessment based on information we've gotten from the NAS and others. The other thing, Madam Chairman, is that my office, the Water Office, is evaluating TCE under our 6-year review process under the Safe Drinking Water Act. We're analyzing new scientific and technological data and information on health effects associated with each regulated contaminant, such as TCE. We're taking this very seriously, and we're looking at it very closely. The other aspect I want to add is that TCE is prevalent. It is a prevalent groundwater contaminant to hazardous waste sites, so we're concerned about vapor intrusion and when it occurs. We're working with federal partners, state regulators, industry, academia, environmental groups, and the general public to understand the rapidly developing science of vapor intrusion. We're developing recommendations for
Mr. Grumbles, could you complete, because I've let you go over a minute and a half, but if we could complete.
Yeah, and we're developing recommendations for interim toxicity values with respect to vapor intrusion. In conclusion, Madam Chair, the agency is committed to robust protection of public health from contaminants in drinking water using the science-based framework. We believe this framework is sound and respectfully request that you allow us time to complete the required analyses and determinations to ensure appropriate science-based protection of public health from these and other contaminants as envisioned by the 96 amendments. We're committed to making a final regulatory determination for perchlorate by the end of this year, and for TCE as soon as the necessary analyses have been completed. Thank you for your patience and the opportunity to discuss this with you.
Thank you, Mr. Rumbles. So you're going to act at the end of '08. Is it possible that EPA could decide not to regulate perchlorate? Is that an option?
That is an option, and that is a distinct possibility, and we're in the final stages of assessing the latest information we've gotten. We would first, before we issue a final determination, we would issue a preliminary determination and take public comment on that,
Okay.
Madam Chair.
So it is a distinct possibility that the EPA, in protecting the public, may determine not to set a standard for perchlorate. Is that correct?
It is. It's
Okay.
a distinct possibility to make another determination as well, but that's where the stage
Right.
we're
Well,
at.
that's what I hear is going to happen. That's what I hear. You've got a lot of good people over there who talk to us. Mm-hmm. And I'm just saying, if that happens, and you could look the American people in the eye and said, we're protecting you, no standard, and you've stopped testing. Why did you stop testing?
Well,
why did you tell the water systems they didn't have to test for perchlorate and let people know if perchlorate is in their water?
After the rounds of the regulation that required utilities to monitor for perchlorate, we got a robust amount of data from 3,800 systems, and we felt that is a sufficient amount of data that can help us to meet one of the three statutory requirements under the Safe Drinking Water Act. I would note two things, Madam Chair. One is that we can still require additional contaminant monitoring if the science leads us to that result.
Okay, I understand. But you think you, the agency, the government, has enough information. Don't you think the people who are drinking the water have a right to know how much perchlorate is in there? They're not stupid. They read the papers. I can imagine what's going on with TCE in Wyoming, my friend told me. People are upset. Now, you have enough information.
We're not
but
saying
maybe,
we haven't.
But, excuse me, you said, EPA said that. You had enough information, you didn't have to test anymore. Is that right?
No, well, the important clarification is that we felt because we want to get on with the process and make a determination on whether or not to issue a new regulation, we felt we had sufficient data on one of the three elements, and that is the occurrence data. Now, that was based on various assumptions. We have never said to any utility you should not test for, or you should stop testing.
But you've stopped requiring it.
That's correct.
Okay.
With the right to reinstitute
Well, I'm sure
that
you
as
always
more
have
science
that.
comes in.
You always have that right. But EPA said, and here it is, I put in the record, we agree with the comments that it is not clear that the agency needs additional information on the occurrence of perchlorate in drinking water. Now, it's
That's
a year and a
correct.
half since you stopped the testing. You still haven't acted. You now say you're going to act at the end of '08, and it's a distinct possibility you could conclude you're not going to set a standard. So if that's the case, and that's what I believe is going to happen after all this falderall, there won't be a standard, a federal standard. The states will have to do it. People will be completely ignorant of the whole situation because they won't be protected by the Drinking Water Act, by EPA, and they won't have the information. It's unbelievable to me that at the minimum, you give people information. Let them make their judgments. Let them have the political information. Let them make it a reason to support a senator or not support a senator or a president or whatever. So I think it is keeping people ignorant is part of what this is about. Now, I just want to ask you something else.
But, Madam Chair,
Yeah.
I just have to say, EPA firmly supports getting as much information as we can out there on perchlorate. Now, what that means is it's not just the occurrence measurements, it's also getting the critical information about other types of exposure, such as food. And so we have been spending the time to get that additional information because we're concerned it's not
Mr.
just
Grumbles,
water, it's food.
you know what? I was not born yesterday, as I keep reminding people. They just have to look at me. They get it.
Right.
I was not born yesterday. What's the best way to give people information? Let them know if it's in their drinking water. Isn't that a lot easier than, go up on our website. And let me ask you this. You testified that EPA's preliminary remediation goal for perchlorate cleanup is based on protecting a 154-pound adult. Shouldn't EPA lower this number to account for the larger amount of water and food that infants and children consume for their body weight compared to adults?
It's been very much a part of our discussions, the need to revisit the preliminary remediation goal as we have spent the last couple of years getting additional information, Madam Chair. So my answer to your question is that yes, that is a distinct possibility of revising the preliminary remediation guidelines, particularly as we've gotten this additional information from the Food and Drug Administration.
Well, you set the standard in '06. This isn't like it happened many years ago. And you set it to protect a 154-pound male.
Right.
And now you're saying, a little while later, a year later, because I'm questioning you, well, maybe you ought to change it.
Well, everyone embraces the concept of adaptive management. We set a time as quickly as we could.
Adaptive management.
That's right.
What does that mean?
That means that,
What does that mean?
Right after the National Academy of Sciences came out with their report, the agency shortly after that adopted a reference dose. After the reference dose, the heads of the Superfund program realized they wanted to have a preliminary remediation goal. So they went with the best information available, and they made assumptions, Madam Chair, about the level, the types of exposure.
Lots of words.
So, well,
Lots of words.
the answer to the question is that what it means is, as you get additional information about food exposure,
Right.
You go back and you look at, is the preliminary remediation goal the proper number at this point?
Well, let me put in the record, your own Children's Health Advisory panel, made up of scientists, and I wish Senator Bond was here, doctors. I'm putting this letter in the record. They told Mr. Johnson on March 8th, 2006, the new PRG is not supported by the underlying science and can result in exposures that pose neurodevelopmental risks in early life. So don't give me, you're just learning this, when your own people. You know why I get so angry?
That was another
Excuse me,
aspect
sir,
to it.
I'm
ma'am.
speaking. Excuse me. You know why I get so angry with you? It's not a personal anger. Because you say things that are not backed up by the facts. You say, as you get additional information, you're going to get tougher. You had that information from your own panel. They told you what you were doing was dangerous. And now you're sitting here under, I would agree, hostile questioning from me and saying, oh, yes, Madam Senator, we're going to take another look at this. I just don't buy it.
I think to be fair, you ought to allow me the chance to say.
Well, let me finish. I'm giving
That
you the chance.
the reason one of the areas of concern they had, and it's not just with EPA, it was with the National Academy of Sciences, was the focus on what is the most sensitive subpopulation. And that wasn't the preliminary remediation goal discussion. It was focused on the reference dose and how the agency got to its DWEL, the drinking water equivalency level. So there has been a very robust debate, Madam Chair, as to what is the most sensitive subpopulation. And I think part of the concern the Children's Health Advisory Group had was that we ended up adopting the perspective of the National Academy of Sciences and viewed the fetus of a pregnant mom. The other issue I was trying to get at and explain the adaptive management, Madam Chair, was that the preliminary remediation goal, when it was set, it was also based on an assumption of the data that we had. They made an assumption that 100% of the contamination source would be coming from water, And we are in the agency discussing, well, we know that food is another significant source. So that's what I meant by the need to embrace adaptive management.
Well, I'm going to turn to Senator Barrasso, but I'm going to put this I want to read you some more of this letter. Because the things that you say just don't comport with the facts. Your own Children's Health Advisory Committee, made up of scientists, told you told Stephen Johnson, told the world in this letter that the standard you had set for the cleanup was not good enough. And I said, I read before, it's not protective of children's health. You tell me adaptive management. Let's see, what does that mean? You set a standard in a low way, and if you get caught at it and you get called before a Senate committee, you might have to adapt and go back. I'm sorry.
Well,
I'm sorry. I find it cynical. And let me read the rest of this. The Children's Health Advisory Panel finds it disturbing that this change in the PRG was made without dissemination of a decision support document or any opportunity for public input. We recommend that OSWER lower the PRG, taking into account infant exposure and susceptibility. And they're very concerned, and this letter states it. You don't have to wait for anything else. These are the people that you're supposed to rely on. So I can only say to you.
could I say one more?
Let me
important,
finish. Let me finish, please, and yes, then you
Thank
can
you.
respond.
Thank you.
I can only say to you that your explanation here today doesn't make any sense. You have to wait for science when your own scientists who care about children already told you.
Well,
And you have admitted you may not even set a standard for perchlorate, and you don't think that having the ordering, if you will, requiring water systems to test for perchlorate really is a good idea. So everything I add up says to me, danger, flashing red light for the public. Again, EPA, a shadow of its former self, celebrating, our great drinking water, and in the back rooms here, derailing what your own scientists want to do to protect kids. It is very disturbing. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I just simply wanted to say that the relationship we have with the Children's Health Advisory Board is an important one. And I said it's a distinct possibility, Madam Chair, that we might determine not to regulate perchlorate. It's also, and this is important, it's also a distinct possibility that we may issue a health advisory. And part of the dynamics that are involved in that is over the last couple of years, we have gotten a lot more information supplementing the National Academy of Sciences about potential risks to children or infants. And so that's important to us. And we also, we have made clear from the beginning, Madam Chair, that our goal was to make a final determination by this year and that we had enough occurrence data. We also realize we may need to revise that approach in terms of monitoring in the future, just like with any emerging contaminant.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like you to know that my state has enough information, and they do have a perchlorate standard. Senator.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Grumbles. We had a chance, I think you started your testimony before you got to your written remarks talking about it, said it doesn't take an act of Congress to, and then you went through a number of different things, lead and copper, airline drinking water. Is that your concern with a bill like this, that we don't really need an act of Congress on this? I mean, I'm kind of getting that as a sense of what you're saying here today.
We think oversight, congressional oversight of the agency as it moves through this regulatory process is critically important, but when it comes to legislating a specific decision on whether or not to regulate and to set a very aggressive time frame, a schedule, we have serious concerns about that. So, Senator, that is the point, is that we have concerns about a legislative directive that overrides the current regulatory framework for decision making.
I wanted to get back to the issue I was talking about earlier with the Cheyenne, Wyoming, and we as the support regulatory agency, I'd ask that you please look into this matter, help clear up the bureaucratic red tape, so that the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality can get to the assistance that they're requesting help with the issues that I've addressed.
Senator, most certainly we will look into that.
And then with my remaining time, as you've been collecting your thoughts, is there anything else you would like to add that you haven't had a chance to say here in some of the dialogue?
Well, we feel that it's important to take both perchlorate and TCE very seriously. On perchlorate, the scientific issues that surround the health effects, and also if there's a meaningful opportunity to reduce risk to human health as required under the Safe Drinking Water Act. That's where we've been spending our time over the last several years, because we recognize it's widespread and it does have risks to health, as the National Academy of Sciences and others have confirmed. So we're committed to going through the process, to working with Congress, and making sure that a science-based decision is made. And on TCE, we have been regulating it for some time, and we're aggressively pursuing additional guidance on vapor intrusion and the reevaluation of the risks, given the scientific issues evolving over the degree to which cancer is caused by TCE. And it's a priority issue as well for us. And in the Drinking Water Office, Senator, we're committed to reviewing it and other contaminants for potential further regulation under our process under the Safe Drinking Water Act.
So it's your concern then that with the current Safe Drinking Water Act and how to regulate water contaminants, and that this bill may override that Safe Drinking Water Act in terms of the listing process and others?
Well, it would, and we understand, and Congress has used its prerogative to direct the agency to regulate specific named contaminants in the past. We see the value, and I think many others see the value in the 96 framework, the 1996 Safe Drinking Water Act amendments that said rather than identifying specific ones or having to regulate an X number by X years, you go through a systematic process. The downside, Senator, is that systematic process can take some time because we have 3 statutory criteria that we need to go through. And we need to make sure, pursuant to the statute, that it's the best available peer-reviewed science. And so it takes some time, but we think overall it's an excellent framework, and would just urge caution to members in a legislative directive that picks which of the 60 or 50 contaminants to regulate, and sets a time frame that may be so ambitious that we may not result in a legally sustainable final product.
So are you working with groups like the Food and Drug Administration, the Center for Disease Control in determining, what's best for our children and ways to protect?
We have been working
with
with them and other agencies and the scientific organizations. We're spending a lot of time lately with Food and Drug Administration, and the biomonitoring study that CDC did is an important one.
All right. Thank you. Madam Chairman, no further questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm going to put the rest of my questions in writing to you. And I'm going to just close with this. Senator Barrasso, thank you very much for showing us the TCE problem in your state. And I'm going to ask unanimous consent to place into the record a list of the contaminated sites throughout this country. There are how many states on TCE? 45 states. 45 states have a problem with TCE. We need a more protective standard there. So there are also 11 Superfund sites in contaminated with TCE where human exposure is not under control. The source of this is the EPA. Mm-hmm. So you've got a situation here where you have sites where human exposure is not under control, and we've got TCE in 45 states, 321 Superfund sites in 45 states and territories contaminated with TCE. You can't drag your feet anymore. And I would say, as for perchlorate, you've got 35 states that have perchlorate in the water at serious levels, and you already have your Children's Health Protection Advisory Committee saying you're not doing enough. You have a American Waterworks Association, Association of Metropolitan Water Agencies, and gets to Senator Barrasso's point, they've urged EPA to set a perchlorate standard for drinking water. These are not, environmental organizations. The American Waterworks Association, the Association of Metropolitan Water Agencies, they want a standard. And I think it gets to Senator Barrasso's very important point. Is it better for EPA to act, or is it better for Congress to act? Well, let me answer that question. EPA should act if it was the Environmental Protection Agency, but they're not doing it. And that's the problem. I mean, go and tell, Senator Feinstein to wait until you deal with phthalates. Go and tell Senator Schumer to deal with other chemicals. People are just not going to listen. And people like Senator Barrasso, who's a very patient man, I think he wants action here in terms of cleanup for his state. The point is, your answers, I'm speaking only for myself, are just very light. They don't give me any comfort at all. As a matter of fact, they even make me more concerned hearing that we may not have a standard. The fact of the matter is, there are sites that are out of control here, and your own scientists have told you to act. Now we know a couple of states have acted on perchlorate. That's the other thing that's going to happen, Senator. The states are going to start setting standards. And right now I know California has 6, Massachusetts has 2, and many other states are waiting. So we're going to have a patchwork quilt. In the meantime, consumers of water don't know how much perchlorate's in their water because the EPA decided it wasn't necessary. So if they go down the path where they're not going to set a standard at the end of the day, which is a, quote, distinct possibility, unquote, and plus they're not requiring testing, our people are in the dark without any help. And we're talking about very dangerous chemicals here. So thank you for coming. We will give you a bunch more questions in writing, and we call up the next panel. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I understand completely. I understand. Thank you for coming. Where's the list for the next panel? It's just, here it is. I got it. That's my fault.
There's a list of things they want to put in the record if you want to read that at some point.
Okay. At this point, do I have to go yet? Not yet to my other? Okay, we'll keep on going then. I want to welcome panel 2, George Alexeff. Did I say it right, Miss Dr. Alexeff? Deputy Director for Science Affairs, Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment for my great state of California. Welcome you. Mike Baker, Chief Division of Drinking and Groundwater in Ohio EPA, on behalf of the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators. Carol Rowan West, Director, Office of Research and Standards, Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. So we're going to ask you to keep your opening statements to 5 minutes, and we'll begin with you, Dr. Alexeff.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee, for the opportunity to testify on perchlorate and TCE in water. I'm George Alexeff, Deputy Director for Scientific Affairs of the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, which we refer to as OEHA in the Environmental Protection Agency of California. As part of our duties under this California Safe Drinking Water Act, OEHA develops public health goals, or PHGs, for drinking water. Perchlorate has been detected in hundreds of drinking water sources in California. Perchlorate inhibits the uptake of iodide, an essential nutrient, by the thyroid gland. Inadequate iodide uptake disrupts proper thyroid function. Thyroid hormones, such as T4 and T3, help regulate growth and maturation of tissues, particularly the brain. Disruption of these hormones can lead to impaired development in fetuses. Several epidemiologic studies indicate that iodide deficiency during pregnancy may affect brain development and may cause intellectual deficits in children. Our review of the scientific literature found that the fetuses of pregnant women are the most sensitive population to perchlorate's health effects. Impairment of thyroid function in expectant mothers may affect the brain of the fetus, resulting in delayed development and decreased learning capacity. In 2004, OEA published a public health goal for perchlorate in drinking water of 6 parts per billion. The level was adopted as the state's drinking water standard. OEA's draft perchlorate assessment underwent 2 rounds of independent peer review by the University of California scientists, as well as several public comment periods. We based our PHG on a controlled human study referred to as the Greer study, which contained the best data for assessing perchlorate's health effects. However, this study was limited because there were only 37 subjects. To ensure we did not underestimate the chemical's effects on pregnant women and fetuses, we added a 10-fold margin of safety. Our PHG also took into account the higher water consumption rate of pregnant women and the potential for perchlorate exposure from food. In 2005, the National Academy of Sciences recommended a similar approach. In 2006, the CDC released a major national study which supports the concerns that we identified. The CDC study found that in women, perchlorate exposure was associated with changes in thyroid hormone levels. The thyroid hormone level changes were consistent with the expected effects of perchlorate. OEA evaluated this data and published a confirmatory article. I will now turn to TCE. Over 350 drinking water sources in California have reportable levels of TCE contamination. Cancer is the primary health effect of concern from TCE exposure. Animal studies indicate that TCE-induced liver and lung carcinomas in mice. Kidney tumors were reported in male rats. The National Toxicology Program has concluded that TCE is reasonably anticipated to be a human carcinogen. Over the past 20 years, California has treated TCE as a carcinogen. In 1988, California listed TCE as a chemical known to the state to cause cancer. In 1990, TCE was listed as a toxic air contaminant based on carcinogenic effects. In 1999, we have published a public health goal of 0.8 parts per billion of trichloroethylene in drinking water. In developing this PHG, we reviewed the animal studies and the limited human studies. Our risk assessment confirmed that this chemical is a potential human carcinogen. We have followed the US EPA cancer review process with great interest and awaited the publication of the National Academy of Sciences report released in 2006. We note that the NAS concluded that the evidence on carcinogenic risk and other health hazards from exposure to trichloroethylene has strengthened since 2001. I hope this summary gives you a better idea of why California has concerns about perchlorate and TCE in water and how we have identified their level of risk to public health. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to testify before you today.
Thank you very much. Mr. Baker, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Chairman. Thank you. Good morning, Madam Chairman, committee members. I am Mike Baker. I'm Chief of the Division of Drinking and Groundwaters at the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency. I'm also the President-elect of the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators, also known as ASDWA. ASDWA supports and represents the collective interest of states, territories, and the Navajo Nation in our administration of national drinking water requirements. I am pleased to be here today and offer testimony on ASDWA's behalf. Overall, ASDWA supports the fundamental construct of the Safe Drinking Water Act as it relates to determining which contaminants are likely to occur in drinking water and whose regulation would provide a meaningful opportunity for health risk reductions. An underlying tenet of the Act is that standard setting should be driven by sound science. That includes robust data on the occurrence of contaminants, information about the abilities of these contaminants to cause health effects, information about technologies and costs to remove or reduce these contaminants, and the expected benefits of doing so. We do appreciate this committee's concerns about perchlorate and TCE. We are, however, concerned about the precedent of using legislative action that supersedes the provision of the statute for particular contaminants. Recent media stories about pharmaceuticals and personal health care products in our sources of drinking water are one example highlighting the need for a rational, scientific-based approach to determining which contaminants should be regulated and at what level. In my own state of Ohio and a few other states, we're grappling with another type of emerging contaminant, PFOA, one of several fluoropolymers used for decades by a variety of manufacturing processes. This particular compound is being detected in the environment, in animals, and in people around the world. And the customers of an Ohio public water system contaminated by PFOA have the highest level of this chemical ever detected in humans. Clearly, we are very concerned about these compounds being in our drinking water at unsafe levels. We expect to see more and more emerging contaminants. We live in a society that uses a myriad of chemicals. That fact, coupled with our increasing ability to detect contaminants at low levels, will undoubtedly raise additional concerns about the safety of our drinking water. Therefore, unless a transparent scientific approach is used, we're concerned EPA will jump from one contaminant to another based on media and political attention rather than on meaningful public health gains. States do agree that EPA needs to make timely decisions on contaminants of concern. Public health protection depends on sound and timely decisions. As my colleagues on this panel have and will described, in the absence of timely decisions by EPA, a few states can and do establish their own standards. Most states, however, simply do not have the necessary resources nor the expertise, and we depend on EPA for timely decisions. In the case of perchlorate and TCE, EPA should be held accountable for describing what data and information, if any, is lacking to support a regulatory decision and make decisions about whether or not to further regulate as rapidly as possible. All of us at the federal, state, and local level have important roles to play to ensure people have access to safe and affordable drinking water. This includes preventing contaminants from reaching the source of our drinking water in the first place. For Congress, an important role is to ensure adequate funding to support research so that information about contaminants is available when it's needed. You must also keep in mind regulations come with a cost burden to state drinking water programs, public water systems, and their customers. Many states and water utilities are already struggling to meet the demands of current regulations. We appreciate your support for the Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Fund and respectfully recommend more funds be appropriated to support a growing infrastructure need. Additional federal dollars are also needed for state drinking water programs to carry out federal regulatory requirements. Current funding levels, which have remained at roughly the same level for over a decade, during the same time states have had to adopt over 15 federal regulatory requirements, are simply inadequate and need to be increased. States and public water supplies need your support. I thank you for the opportunity to offer testimony and would be pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Baker. And now we're going to hear from Carol Rowan West, Director, Office of Research and Standards, Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Boxer and committee members, for the opportunity to testify today on this issue of perchlorate and drinking water. As a scientist and Director of the Office of Research and Standards at the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, I have spent over 15 years evaluating the toxic effects of chemicals and setting standards that are protective of public health. I have no doubt that perchlorate is a chemical that should be regulated in the nation's drinking water supply, given the fact that this chemical is one that affects the thyroid gland, can affect levels of thyroid hormone that are needed for the proper development of the brain in the fetus, infants, and young children. The health effects of perchlorate are well known and are based on sound science. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts' work on perchlorate began in 2001, when perchlorate was detected in the groundwater at 600 parts per billion at the Massachusetts Military Reservation on Cape Cod. The contaminated groundwater plume migrated to nearby public water supply wells. Given the lack of federal and state standards for perchlorate and the potential for perchlorate to affect brain development in children, we felt compelled to set a drinking water standard. We promulgated a 2-part per billion perchlorate standard in 2006 based upon a thorough review of all of the scientific information, and we worked along with an independent review by external scientific advisory committee. After all of the public water supplies were tested in Massachusetts, we found a number of unanticipated situations, including perchlorate levels as high as 1,300 parts per billion in one public water supply. We found that all of the contaminated public water supplies were from non-military sources of perchlorate, including blasting, fireworks, and sodium hypochlorite, a chemical that is used to treat and disinfect drinking water. As mentioned earlier, there appears to be sufficient evidence that there's widespread contamination of perchlorate in the United States. Surveys show that 26 states and 2 territories have perchlorate in its drinking water. 37 states and territories show over 400 hazardous waste sites with perchlorate present at them. In addition, there are new studies that demonstrate the pervasiveness of perchlorate exposures to the American public, raising issues regarding human safety. The Food and Drug Administration has found that 59% of the total food samples tested contain perchlorate, including baby food. Children with the FDA estimated that children of the age of 2 years old would receive the highest intake of perchlorate a day. At this age, the brain is rapidly growing, and it puts these young children at risk, especially given the fact that the amount of perchlorate from water and from food may go over the level, producing thyroid hormone levels alterations that could affect brain development. A very recently study just published on Boston women and breast milk contamination with perchlorate found that all 49 of the women tested had perchlorate, and the levels ranged from 1.3 to 411 parts per billion. And lastly, as mentioned earlier, the Center for Disease Control has found through its national survey that perchlorate is pervasive in the American public, and that in the high-risk group of women with low iodide intake, that they are showing alterations in thyroid hormone levels. All of these studies indicate widespread contamination and exposure to perchlorate in both water and the food supplies of Americans. The benefits of having a national perchlorate drinking water standard are that all of the public water supplies will be tested, so we'll have complete information. Then action can be taken to treat the water to protect children's health. We recommend that the U.S. EPA should take a leadership role to set a perchlorate drinking water standard which protects children's health. Perchlorate contamination is a national issue, and national action is needed. Federal action will lead to consistent protection of children's health across the United States. And lastly, the cleanup of water supplies and sites has the additional benefit of also decreasing the levels of perchlorate in food, including breast milk. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I'll be pleased to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. Ms. West, can you explain for us what are the results of too much perchlorate in terms of the thyroid? What actually happens, and how does it impact a pregnant woman, and how does it impact the fetus?
Yeah, well, when pregnant women when they're pregnant, they have a lot of stress on their thyroid gland, and so they have sometimes lower amount of iodide, produced in order to make thyroid hormone. So when pregnant women are exposed to perchlorate, their thyroid hormone level is reduced. Now, the fetus depends on thyroid hormone levels from the mother, and when the mother is exposed, it may not be able to provide the necessary levels of thyroid hormone to the fetus. In early life stages of the fetus, they aren't producing any thyroid hormone whatsoever, so they're totally dependent on what the mother can deliver. So if the mother isn't making enough thyroid hormone, it's going to have an impact on the brain development of that child.
So this is very serious. And you said some systems, there's 411 parts per billion it's been found?
In one breast milk sample from Boston, Massachusetts, where we do not have perchlorate in our drinking water.
Doctor, do you want to add to any of those adverse impacts, or did Ms. West pretty well cover it?
I think she covered it very well. I would just add that perchlorate also prevents iodide from transferring through the placenta through the fetus. And also it blocks iodide transference from in breast milk to the newborn.
And that could result in developmental disabilities?
That would add to the effect of perchlorate itself. So there's the perchlorate effect on the thyroids of either the newborn or the fetus and the mother, as well as the lower amount of iodide getting to them.
Well, I'm going to talk to Mr. Baker because I think his approach, I understand where he's coming from. I don't agree with his conclusion, but I want to just open up. I think your mind might be open to this few things that I say here. First of all, here's the problem. To say that Congress shouldn't get involved, it's a bad precedent. I hear you. I don't want to get involved. I don't want to. Senator Klobuchar doesn't want to. Senator Lautenberg, Senator Clinton, those of us who are working in this committee to protect our people don't want to. We want the EPA to act. Now we hear today from two very straightforward witnesses with no axe to grind. They're not politicians. They're experts in health. That what can happen if there's too much perchlorate in the water, it's very, very serious for a pregnant woman and her fetus and could have devastating impacts. And for all we know, probably is having devastating impacts as we speak because there's no standard. So what happens is we have information dating back, well, probably 20 years, but we know since 1992, EPA has talked about the proper standard for perchloride. Listen to this. This is dated January 25th, 2002. I want to thank my staff for finding this out here. A long-awaited U.S. EPA draft toxicological report issued on January 18th finds that perchlorate is likely to be more harmful to human health than previously thought. EPA, okay, 02. In response to the report's conclusion that perchlorate concentrations of less than 1 part per billion are safe for human consumption in drinking water, the California Department of Health reduced its advisory action level from 18 parts per billion to 4 parts per billion. So the work of EPA in the past in letting folks know the danger has led to state action. Very good. But why do we hear today, and Senator Klobuchar may be shocked to hear this, that our EPA witness said it's, what were his words? It's conceivable. Is that what? It's a distinct possibility that they may come out with no standard whatsoever for perchlorate. So here's where we are. And this is where I want to talk to Mr. Baker and try to get him to see it a little bit differently. When you talk about it's a bad precedent for Congress to move in here, I say to you, I don't want to go down that road, but we've already gone down that road. Senator Feinstein and I had an amendment that passed the Senate pretty overwhelmingly. I don't remember the exact vote to ban phthalates. Why? EPA does nothing. Are we supposed to sit back and say it's bad precedent to do this, or are we going to protect the people? That's the issue here. And, you know, I agree, legislation to get into protecting the people chemical by chemical isn't my favorite way to go. I want to get an EPA that does something. It'd be a lot easier on us here. We don't have to sit and have these kinds of hearings. And we also had the Children's Health Advisory Panel, Senator, tell the EPA that they're not doing enough, that they're very worried. So you can't sit back. You can't tell me Mr. Baker, with all due respect, that if I care so much about my people that I'm willing to push for this standard, and we're not setting the standard, we're just saying to EPA, get off your delay and do this. That's what our bill says. First, we say we should test for it and let the public know. And secondly, we say you should set a standard by a date certain because this thing is going. I mean, if I told you, for example, that this president or some other president woke up one morning and just acted, in my view, irrationally and said, we are, by executive order, temporarily suspending all environmental protection laws because it's in the best national security of our nation to do it. Let's say, you know, presidents do things we don't agree with. Obviously, I don't think you'd say Congress don't get involved. I mean, at some point when nothing gets done, we're accountable to the people that we represent. Now, I know that your Drinking Water Association doesn't support having a standard set for perchlorate, but I'm sure you know the American Water Works Association, the Association of Metropolitan Water Agencies, have urged that EPA set a perchlorate standard. And I think it's unusual to see someone who's got to deal with this take this kind of attitude. I mean, I respect you, and you have every right to, but if I look at Ohio, you should see you're the 12th worst site for TCE. You've got perchlorate, you've got TCE, and you're the 12th worst state for TCE. So I guess what I want you to think about is this. The minute we set a standard here, you will be eligible for some cleanup funds. And I agree with you completely. There's not enough funding. And we're spending $5,000 a minute in Iraq. You think we'd have some funding to help you clean this up, and that's a whole other debate. But I wonder if you would think about this, that by backing the EPA in this foot-dragging, you are putting off the day when you could be eligible for funds to clean up your water supply, and you're not protecting the people that you serve very well either. So I just wonder if you'd be open to reconsideration and perhaps join with the largest water utility and trade associations, two of the largest, and urge them to set a standard, EPA to set a standard.
Madam Chairman, certainly as an administrator of a state drinking water program, along with my other colleagues that have that responsibility, we share the concern about any contaminants that are in our water supplies at an unsafe level. One clarification, it is not, as was positioned, that we are opposed to EPA establishing a standard. It may very well be that after looking at the occurrence data through the UCMR, the studies by the NSA, the studies by the Food and Drug Administration, the information generated by other states, that a standard for perchlorate is an appropriate action. And we also believe that they have the building blocks in place at this point in time after that information to make a regulatory decision. And we certainly hope and encourage them to make that very, very soon. So we share that, but we continue to have the concern that if we use legislative action to set the standard for perchlorate and TCE now, then with the myriad of chemicals that we know are out there, we know are starting to show up in our drinking water supplies, we know as we're able to detect them at very low levels, we're going to raise additional questions. We just think we need to have the appropriate structure in place that we vet all of these chemicals through in making those decisions.
So you want them to set a standard?
We want them to make a decision on it very quickly.
Well, good. Then you should back my bill, because that's exactly what we say. We say set a standard by a certain date. The last thing I want to do is put into the record, and I'm going to turn to my colleague, an article that appeared, this is really important, in April 28th, 2003. This whole stonewalling that we saw here from the EPA is not news. The headline in the Wall Street Journal back then was, EPA bans staff from discussing issue of perchlorate pollution. The Pentagon and several defense contractors who face billions of dollars in potential cleanup liability vehemently oppose EPA's high health risk assessment, arguing perchlorate is safe at levels 200 times higher than what the EPA says is safe. The Bush administration has imposed a gag order on the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency from publicly discussing perchlorate pollution, even as 2 new studies reveal high levels of rocket fuel component may be contaminating the nation's lettuce supply. So I think the reason we were so interested in having this hearing is what you're seeing here today from the EPA is just a continuation of the Stonewall. And the reason why we're going to have some action here on this issue in June once we've completed our global warming on the floor is because a lot of us have had it, and we agree, Mr. Baker, they should do it. They should do it according to the science, and that's just what our bills say. Senator Klobuchar. And last, thank you to California and Massachusetts for being leaders. I just so respect what you're doing.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Chairwoman Boxer, for holding this hearing. In Minnesota, thankfully, we haven't found a lot of perchlorate contamination, but we also haven't done a lot of testing. So it's possible we may have a problem we don't know about. I will tell you that we do have a number of Tce contamination sites, and we also have hundreds of smaller Tce contamination sites. And these cleanups have been carried out on Tce, but it's been described to me that by our water experts that it takes a long time to get rid of it. No matter how many times you rinse it, it's kind of like cleaning a greasy pan with cold water, and it's estimated that it'll take 25 years to break down. But I want to get to the topic you all have testified about and follow up on some of Chairman Boxer's questions. Ms. West, I was struck by your testimony about all of the scientific work that you've had to do in Massachusetts at the state level. And one of my concerns here as I look at all of these issues, whether it's climate change or whether it's the regulation of these dangerous substances, that more and more work has been pushed to the state level without the resources to go with it. And especially, for instance, in the climate change area, it gets absurd because you have 33 states trying to form together to do a climate registry because nothing's been done on the national level. Could you talk a little bit about the burden that's been placed on your state and what kind, have you gotten resources for it in terms of trying to set some standards for perchlorate?
Well, just going back a little bit historically, back in 2003, EPA seemed to be rapidly advancing in setting a reference dose for perchlorate. I believe that in 2003 they were supposed to have a draft reference dose, so we actually were going to rely on their work, but then it got delayed, so we took up our own work. Now, the Office of Research and Standards is very fortunate. We have 11 staff, toxicologists and risk assessors, and we worked almost full-time on perchlorate until 2006 when we promulgated our standards. The work also entailed the director of our water supply program, the Bureau of Wayside Cleanup staff. It involved the Commissioner's office. It involved our regional offices because we had to go out and deal with the contamination, find out what the sources were, and do cleanup. So it was a very large effort for us to undertake, and I do think if there was federal action, then it would reduce the burden on states having to do this type of work.
Thank you very much. And you also said something that makes a lot of sense to me. Since we know that perchlorate can cause developmental harm to pregnant women and children, that it would make some sense to set the standard now and refine it later or do something, because what concerns me here is we have some scientific research, but yet nothing is happening on the EPA level. And it seems to me we should err on the side of caution. Do you want to respond to that and how you could envision this getting done?
Well, I totally agree with you. I think that there's well-known information on the health effects of perchlorate, and it's based on sound science, and there's much information to put together to set a drinking water standard. I mean, I look at this situation and I say, what is missing? We have the data. We have everything that we need. We have protocols for setting drinking water standards established. We follow those and take action. I think we have all that we need.
Dr. Alexie, you talked about how California set a standard and there's peer review. Do you feel that there's enough national information to move forward?
Yes, of course we do. And we're in the process now. There's been so much additional information. We're coming up on our 5-year cycle for reconsidering perchlorate and seeing if our current standard is reflective of the actual data. So we think there was sufficient data when we set our standard, and well, both in 2004 for the goal, and then in 2007 for the official state standard. And since that time, there's just been additional information supporting that.
Dr. Alexie, did I say your name right?
Alexieff is.
You're like me, no one knows how to say my name. You talked also about the effect, or in your written testimony, about on pregnant mothers and fetuses and brain development. And you've mentioned that studies have shown that children's performance in schools can be affected. Have there been other effects on children that have been documented?
Well, the actual way that perchlorate causes an effect is by blocking iodide from being used to make the important hormones for brain development. So there's a lot of information on what the importance of iodide is. So if we don't allow our bodies to utilize the iodide that's there, we won't have proper brain development in the children. I think there's more than enough data showing that.
And just when you base, my last question here, the California standards, did you look at data from other parts of the country as well? Scientific data?
To a certain extent. I mean, we looked at certainly all of the health information that was available. We were aware of the contamination in various parts of the country, and of course, a lot of our source of drinking water was from the Colorado River, which was one of our major concerns because it is contaminated with the perchlorate as well.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Klobuchar has said that she's going to come back, and when I have to leave, she will chair the third panel. So we should have a seamless hearing today. Senator, thank you so much. You're always such a helpful part of this committee. I thank you very much. And I ask unanimous consent to enter into record recent studies describing perchlorate exposure in people and its impacts on human health, statements by Professor Daniel Wartenberg and Professor Tom Zoller on TCE and perchlorate, newspaper articles describing the White House and federal agencies interfering in the creation of protective TCE and perchlorate standards, and a letter from EPA's Children Health Protection Advisory Committee, and a scientific article criticizing EPA's perchlorate remediation goal as being unprotective. So we'll put those in the record. Thank you, panelists. I think you've been terrific, very direct, and very helpful. And our final panel, please come up. Donna Lupardo, Assemblywoman from the state of New York. Gail Charnley, PhD, Health Risk Strategies. David Hole, PhD, Professor, Medical University of South Carolina. Richard Wiles, Executive Director, Environmental Working Group. We welcome you all. We're very pleased to have you. And I invite you to drink the water if you want to.
Is it bottled?
So we'll start off with Assemblywoman Lupardo from the 126th Assembly District of New York. Thank you very much, Assemblywoman.
Thank you.
Make sure you put your light on. Your speaker on. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you, Madam Chair, and members of the committee for your commitment to this issue and for allowing me to present my remarks on this topic. First, let me say that I'm not a scientist. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm simply an advocate for the community that I represent in the New York State Assembly. I represent the 126th District. It includes the city of Binghamton, the towns of Union and Vestal, Located in the town of Union is the village of Endicott, birthplace of IBM and Endicott Johnson's shoes. My remarks today reflect Endicott's long journey into the world of TCE contamination and my own journey to find answers. Prior to my election, I was a member of the Resident Action Group of Endicott. Along with Congressman Hinchey, the group helped raise public awareness about the dangers of vapor intrusion and drinking water contamination. Working together, the Endicott site was reclassified back in 2003 after it was discovered that underground water contamination produced toxic vapors into people's homes and businesses. I also served as a member of the Stakeholders Planning Committee, which met regularly with members of ATSDR and our state's Department of Health and Environmental Conservation. In Endicott, there are over 480 homes spread out over 300 acres, fitted with ventilation systems designed to address chemical vapor intrusion because of a large underground plume of contamination. These vapors are the legacy of the microelectronics industry that once dominated our local economy. Fortunately for Endicott residents, there was a responsible party available. IBM was in a position to assist with the costs of not only the ventilation systems, but with pumping stations, monitoring wells, ambient air testing, and an air stripper needed to address the contamination of wells that supplied drinking water to 46,000 residents in the town of Union, including my own home in Enwell. In August of 2005, the New York State Department of Health released a health statistics review for the Endicott site that documented elevated rates of testicular cancer, kidney cancer, and heart birth defects in the Endicott area. The review found that these elevated rates were statistically significant, meaning that they are unlikely to be due to chance alone. This review validated what residents have been talking about for years. Unfortunately, their fears only grew. I also serve on the Environmental Conservation Committee in the New York State Assembly. After conducting several hearings around the state, we issued a report in 2006 entitled Vapor Intrusion of Toxic Chemicals, an Emerging Public Health Concern. One finding is particularly relevant to today's hearing. We found that the New York State air guideline for TCE of 5.0 micrograms per cubic meter of air was not based on the most protective assumptions supported by science. In developing its guidance for TCE, our Department of Health made a number of choices that resulted in a less protective standard, including the choice not to consider the epidemiologic studies used by EPA in its 2001 draft assessment, the choice not to use a new and stronger epidemiological study as a source of quantitative values, and the choice not to consider animal studies which show an association between exposure to TCE and testicular cancer, lymphoma, and lung cancer based on a lack of human evidence. As a result, our health department, our guideline now is 2 orders of magnitude higher than the most risk-based concentrations for TCE in air developed by California, Colorado, New Jersey, and several EPA regional offices, which range from 0.016 to 0.2 micrograms per cubic meter of air. New York also changed its TCE guidelines in 2003 in the middle of the IBM cleanup, leaving many homeowners confused and frustrated because they were no longer eligible for ventilation systems. They went from a 0.22 microgram to their current level of 5.0 micrograms per cubic meter of air. Our Environmental Conservation Committee strongly recommended that our Department of Health revise its current indoor air guideline for TCE to reflect the most protective assumptions about toxicity and exposure supported by science. We believed that in the face of uncertainty regarding the threat of harm to human health posed by vapor intrusion, the Department of Health should err on the side of caution and adopt a much more conservative approach. Unfortunately, Madam Chair, they did not. While we are attempting to address this issue legislatively in New York State, we desperately need federal leadership on this topic. The Toxic Chemical Exposure Act, Exposure Reduction Act, would finally provide a national primary drinking water regulation for TCE and an all-important reference concentration of TCE vapor that is protective of susceptible populations, along with important health advisories. It would put an end to a confusing hodgepodge of individual state guidelines and arbitrary regulations. As you said before, Madam Chair, we don't want to legislate this, and we're having resistance trying to legislate it, frankly. And just a couple of points to wrap up. I am also encouraged that the legislation establishes the Integrated Risk Information System reference concentration of TCE vapor. I am, however, deeply concerned that EPA's new interagency review process will actually increase the challenges that they face in evaluating and regulating chemicals. The IRIS database could soon become obsolete because of the backlog of ongoing assessments. I hope that the TCE assessment does not fall prey to policy biases that overshadow good science, as you have said many times.
Yes, I'm going to ask you to finish up.
Yep. Finally, last point, I'd be remiss if I did not briefly mention another related matter, and it has to do with the OSHA standard. They have set an exposure limit of 100 parts of TCE per million parts of air for an 8-hour workday, 40-hour work week. Surely a separate investigation of workplace exposure is warranted, especially for communities like Endicott, where many residents were exposed at home and at work. Thank you for allowing me to testify. I'm deeply grateful for your
Thank you very much, Assemblywoman.
Yep.
Dr. Charnley.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all today. EPA has a well-established process for setting drinking water contaminant levels that has been evolving for 30 years and has resulted in one of the safest drinking water supplies in the world. The Safe Drinking Water Act and its amendments reflect the best of Congress' ability to craft statutes that are effective and sensible. Setting drinking water standards or any other limit on human exposure to chemical contaminants requires balancing the need to be precautionary and protect public health with the need to develop an adequate factual basis to justify regulation. In other words, EPA must act to prevent health risks from drinking water contaminants, but must also determine that regulating contaminants would present a meaningful opportunity to reduce health risk. There are costs associated both with regulating too soon, when health risks turn out to be negligible, and with regulating too late after health risks have occurred. Finding the right balance is what the Safe Drinking Water Act empowers EPA to do. There are many examples of the challenging process involved in trying to set exposure limits for substances in a world of evolving science. Perchlorate is a perfect example. Until recently, EPA's continued efforts to characterize the hazards of perchlorate have been repeatedly thwarted by peer review panels. Perchlorate first made it onto EPA's radar screen in 1985 when it was found to be a contaminant of Superfund sites in California. Toxicity data were sparse, and a provisional reference dose was adopted by EPA in 1992. That provisional dose was replaced by a different provisional reference dose in 1995. Peer review of that provisional reference dose concluded in 1997 that it was not adequately supported by data and proposed a toxicity testing strategy. EPA listed it as an unregulated drinking water contaminant of potential concern in 1998 and released a draft risk assessment with yet another provisional reference dose. Another peer review recommended waiting for the results of the studies that had been recommended in 1997. A revised draft risk assessment was released in 2002 that incorporated the new data and proposed a fourth provisional reference dose. Peer review of that reference dose by the National Academy of Sciences resulted in a fifth reference dose, which is the one that was adopted in 2005. And of course, reference doses are advisory, not regulatory. Now, does that mean that, pardon me? Meanwhile, what about the costs of regulating versus not regulating perchlorate? The Safe Drinking Water Act requires EPA to establish contaminant levels at which no known or anticipated adverse effects on the health of persons occur and which allows an adequate margin of safety. So let's ask that question. Are known or anticipated adverse effects on health occurring? One approach to answering that question is to compare EPA's reference dose to the levels we're actually exposed to. The reference dose is the perchlorate exposure level, of course, anticipated to be without adverse effects. And based on the data from the Centers for Disease Control, we know that the average exposure to perchlorate in the U.S. is about 1/10 the reference dose, and the highest exposures are about 1/3 the reference dose. Based on CDC and FDA data, our exposure is 10,000 times less than what the National Academy of Sciences concluded would be required to produce adverse effects in healthy adults. The good news is that the American public is apparently not being exposed to perchlorate levels that are likely to pose a risk to our health. Now, does that mean we shouldn't regulate perchlorate? Not necessarily. Perchlorate occurs naturally in the environment, but is also a widespread anthropogenic contaminant and probably should be regulated. Fortunately, however, there appears to be no imminent public health threat that justifies regulating in advance of the science. And of course, just because there is no drinking water standard at present doesn't mean that precautionary risk management measures shouldn't be taken to prevent further contamination, but I think it does illustrate how legislation compelling EPA to regulate perchlorate would run the risk of freezing a standard in place in reaction to politics, not risk-based priorities, and essentially constitutes an environmental earmark. Former EPA Administrator Bill Riley referred to this phenomenon as regulating based on moments of episodic panic in reaction to news stories, not science. EPA's landmark 1987 report, Unfinished Business, concluded that its priorities were influenced too much by public opinion and emphasized the desirability of setting agency priorities based on risk where possible. I believe in setting priorities based on science and directing resources where they will have a demonstrable impact on public health, and not in environmental earmarks or symbolic acts that misdirect limited resources without public health benefit. Thank you very much, and I would like to also add to the record a paper that I recently had accepted for publication in a peer-reviewed journal called Perchlorate, Overview of Risks and Regulation.
Thank you. You're right, there is politics in the system. GAO just said it's at the risk assessment level that EPA is putting politics into the system and shunting the scientists to the back. You're right on that point. It's not here. It's there, and that's the sad thing. We're going to skip over Dr. Hull for a minute because I have so little time, and since I asked Richard Wiles to be here, I'd like to hear his statement, if you don't mind, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today. We'll focus my remarks today on perchlorate. Now, perchlorate provides a textbook example of a corrupted health protection system where polluters, the Pentagon, the White House, and the EPA have conspired to block health protections in order to pad budgets, curry political favor, and protect corporate profits. With perchlorate, we have reached that rare moment in environmental health when there is nothing left to do but act. All of the pieces needed to support strong health protections are in place. Contamination of food, tap water, and breast milk is widespread and well documented. We have a clear understanding of the dangers to infants, children, and women of childbearing age. A strong body of science ties perchlorate exposures to potentially very serious adverse effects in the human population, anchored by a study of more than 1,100 women by the CDC that links perchlorate levels in the population to dangerously low thyroid hormone levels in women of childbearing age. It is rare that science provides us with such a clear picture of a pollutant's harmful effects, which have been termed consistent with causality by the CDC. It is even more unusual to have this level of evidence and to do nothing. Yet this administration has failed to act. Instead of action, we have delay, and worse, as exposed by this committee last week, we have the institutionalization of a new delay strategy replete with secret White House reviews of science and a shift of public health decision-making away from agencies with the expertise to agencies responsible for the pollution. This begs the question, why? The answer is the enormous magnitude of the liability. Simply put, perchlorate is an environmental and public health nightmare of epic proportions for the Department of Defense and its contractors, and rather than address it head-on and protect the public health, they have spent 50 years and millions of dollars trying to avoid it. 90% of all perchlorate in the United States was manufactured for use by the DoD or NASA. Perchlorate contaminates at least 153 public water systems serving about 25 million people in at least 28 states. At least 61 DoD facilities are contaminated with perchlorate, and 35 of those are listed on the National Priorities List for Superfund Site designation. Hundreds of miles of the Colorado River are also polluted with perchlorate. This not only means that the tap water of Las Vegas, Phoenix, parts of Los Angeles, and San Diego are laced with perchlorate, but it also means that much of the nation's winter vegetable crops are contaminated because they are irrigated with perchlorate-polluted water from the Colorado River. The goal of defense contractors and the Pentagon has been to avoid cleanup of their massive perchlorate mess, regardless of the health consequences to the American people. To date, they have been largely successful. It is abundantly clear that without congressional intervention, the public will not receive the protection that is so clearly justified by the science and so obviously necessary given the widespread contamination of food, water, and people. No state health agency that has independently evaluated perchlorate supports the EPA's safe contamination level, the so-called preliminary remediation goal, PRG, of 24.5 parts per billion. California has set a drinking water standard at 6. New Jersey has proposed one at 5. Massachusetts has set a safe level at 2. But most states depend on the EPA. EPA's own children's health experts have strongly criticized the standard. In March 2006, the EPA's top independent science advisory group, the Children's Health Protection Advisory Committee, wrote a strong letter to EPA Administrator Stephen Johnson. protesting the PRG. In the words of the committee, the perchlorate PRG does not protect infants and children and should be lowered. The agency ignored the advice. 5 months later, in September 2006, the CDC published a landmark study on the potential health impacts of chronic perchlorate exposure. The study of 1,100 women found a statistically significant dose-dependent association between perchlorate exposure and changes in thyroid hormone levels in all women in the study. The study showed convincingly that measurable adverse health effects from perchlorate exposure are occurring in the American population at levels previously thought to be safe and at exposure levels commonly experienced by the average person. Madam Chair, members of the committee, the time to protect the public from perchlorate is now. And we support, we commend Senator Boxer for her leadership on the issue and urge this committee to move quickly on S-150, the Protecting Pregnant Women and Children from Perchlorate Act. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now, here's where we are. I'm going to turn the gavel over to Senator Klobuchar, and Senator Dr. David Howell has not spoken yet. And so after that point, it would go to you and then back and forth. But I just want to say to this panel all, thank you so very much for being here and helping us grapple with these very serious matters. Thank you very much.
Dr. Hull. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. Okay. You know, I haven't testified now for many years now that I've been in the university, which I should say for 20 years I was at National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. I was the director of risk assessment, and that is the institute for the environment within the National Institutes of Health. I primarily now work with radiation health effects, but have paid some attention to the chemical issues. I was a member of the SAB's panel on perchlorate and the SAB's panel on TCE, as well as a peer reviewer for the National Academy's report on TCE. So I have a little knowledge of what's going on there. I'd like to talk to you briefly about the process of setting levels for carcinogens that are used by, I guess, IRS or the EPA currently, and how these approaches are different from what's going on somewhat in Europe, World Health Organization, and so on. Now, if we take TCE, which I will talk about, and the cancer of TCE, is primarily kidney cancer, according to the Academy. That is the driver among the cancers. Liver cancer is equivocal, and they dismissed lung cancer and so on. But taking the kidney cancer, when EPA did evaluate this and set their levels, they considered 3 studies: a Finnish worker study, a German worker study, and a rat study, and came up with 3 levels. The problem is each level disagreed by a factor of 100. So the difference between the lowest and the highest was a factor of 10,000, which wouldn't give you much confidence in attempting to set any sort of level based on this. And what is the problem here? One is doing things by individual cancer sites in individual studies. What can be done is to do joint analyses, as is done in radiation health effects. The World Health Organization at IARC recently came out with a study of 400,000 nuclear workers in 15 countries, a joint analysis. Joint analyses have also been done at IARC. I supported one financially when I was at NIH for phenoxyacid herbicides, which is a dioxin type of exposure, and they've done other studies where they bring these groups together. NCI has done some of this in radiation cancer. Short of that, you can do meta-analyses, but you have to do it properly with appropriate doses and bring in the analysis. I'm running out of time here. I'm starting to lecture. In any case, there are methods, modern statistical methods, and you'll see these in the radiation business. UNSCARE, which is the United Nations report, it will be coming out this spring. They have, or this summer, on the new standards for radiation health effects that are used worldwide, some of the new statistical methods that are being done there, using Bayesian techniques and uncertainties and so on. Now, of course, my issue is to integrate the scientific laboratory understandings with the animal toxicology, with the pharmacokinetics, and bring that together to come up with some intelligent risk estimates in cancer. My recommendations are using this integrated, EPA should use this integrated approach and follow the advice of their SAB and the National Academy NRC Committee. It should focus on the best estimate of risk with the uncertainty on the best estimate of risk and not just working with upper bounds. It should consider the recommendation that the National Academy gave them, and that was that the data wasn't sufficiently good for the epidemiology, and they should use the animal data for setting the TCE standards and use the human data to validate what is coming up from the animal studies. Okay, that's one issue. Second recommendation I would make is that there is no process for developing methods in risk assessment by the EPA. It seems like they should get some quality outside advice. Maybe members from the NRC committee could help them during the process of developing their risk estimates, as opposed to presenting the risk estimate and then getting criticisms and comments on it. Finally, there's a basic issue of developing research programs. In the Senator Domenici had one for low-dose radiation effects, and that's been going on for a number of years. Good basic laboratory work through the Office of Science of DOE, and similar things should be done for chemicals in our environment. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Assemblywoman Lepardo, I understand you represent the district where my legislative director has her hometown. Is that correct? Maura Campion. Thank you for being here. You expressed concern during your testimony about EPA's new policy on creating the IRIS risk assessments. The Government Accountability Office recently testified that the new policy would undercut the credibility of these assessments because it kept interagency comments secret. Do you think that the people that you represent, and from what you've seen of this issue, that they would want an open scientific process when the federal government develops a safety level that would be used to protect people from TCE?
There's no doubt about it, Senator. They are desperately in need of solid leadership on this topic. I have been trying everything I can at the state level, but there is resistance to micromanaging the science when we look to the EPA for their assistance. It's frustrating to think that we could go to all this trouble and perhaps even pass this legislation only to see it mired down in this sort of bureaucratic mess.
Could you expand a little and explain in more detail why it's important for your constituents to install ventilation systems in their homes due to TCE contamination?
Well, after it was discovered about the underground plume of contamination, we and the subsequent health studies showing elevated cancer and other risks, there was really no choice but to have these systems installed so that the homes could be livable. We have, close to almost 500 homes that are venting into the system. And there is even some evidence that the ambient air in that community has been affected, especially when there's heavy cloud cover from all the venting in the community as well. So it's extremely important that we have those systems in place. We were lucky, as I said before, we had a responsible party. Many communities do not have that luxury.
If EPA had updated its safety standard for TCE exposure and set a strict new standard that considered all types of exposure to TCE, could this have helped your constituents?
Yes, most definitely.
How would it have helped? How would it have helped?
Their situation would have certainly received much more timely attention, but also because of some arbitrary decision that was made at our state health department where they changed the standard midstream, they would have been protected by the most protective standard supported by science instead of some bureaucratic change.
Thank you, Ms. Charnley. Do you agree with Massachusetts' perchlorate standard?
Well, do I agree with the number or the fact that they set one?
Do you agree with the fact that they have a standard? Do you agree with the number? Both questions.
I think that they're certainly well within their prerogative to set a standard. I think that the number is too stringent, and I say that because one of the things about perchlorate is that it acts by the same biological mechanism of action as, say, nitrates and thiocyanates, which are present ubiquitously in our food and water. And we are exposed to about 1,000 times higher doses of those substances every day based on the RFD compared to perchlorate, but we don't seem to be worried about those. So I think that if you regulate perchlorate, you should think about it in sort of the larger context of the other substances that we're exposed to that act the same way, the cumulative and aggregate risks, and the larger public health context.
And so when you commented on the standard, I think that you said it didn't have a defensible standard basis at the time. Is that right?
I think that's probably what I must have meant, yes.
Right. And then the state of Massachusetts criticized your comments and pointed out that this is a quote, a panel of independent scientists with extensive expertise in the areas of toxicology, risk assessment, and epidemiology developed the proposed standard. They went on to say this independent committee concluded that the basis of the proposed standard was well supported and appropriate.
Well, but they didn't consider these other possibilities, that's all.
And since you commented on the proposed standard and you said that it did not have a defensible scientific basis, has that changed at all? Do you believe that it has a defensible scientific basis?
No, for the reasons I just stated.
Okay, thank you. White House.
Thank you, Chairman. I have what appears to be a Wall Street Journal article talking about the perchlorate issue from 2003, and it says the following. In another step, the White House Office of Management and Budget intervened last month to delay further regulatory action on perchlorate by referring the health debate to the National Academy of Sciences for review. Pending that study, which could take an additional 6 to 18 months, the EPA ordered its scientists and regulators not to speak about perchlorate, said Suzanne Ackerman, an EPA spokeswoman. The gag order prevented EPA scientists from commenting or elaborating Friday on 2 lettuce studies, which show lettuce available in U.S. supermarkets appears to absorb and concentrate perchlorate from polluted irrigation water in significant amounts. The reference to the National Academy of Sciences, I'm just trying to connect the dots here. Mr. Wiles, in your testimony, you highlighted a 2003 effort by the White House to stack the National Academy of Sciences panel with industry consultants. To highlight your testimony, you said that senior White House political officials with no scientific expertise actively participated in reviewing the scientific charge sent to the National Academy of Sciences on perchlorate. You further said that White House and Pentagon officials were involved in discussions about who should be appointed to the NAS panel. And finally, you said that the panel initially included a paid industry expert witness and 2 other paid consultants to the perchlorate industry. Is the National Academy of Sciences appointment process that you describe in your testimony the same one that I referenced in the Wall Street Journal article, do you know?
I presume that it is, yes.
There's just been the one National Academy of Science review?
Yes, there's only one
right?
report that's been done, that's correct.
Okay. I appreciate very much Assemblywoman Lupardo's testimony about the substantive problems of exposure in her community and how hard she's had to fight to remedy them. But I'm also concerned about the structural problem in and surrounding EPA of whether or not the organization itself has been polluted with politics and the extent to which it is breaking up the infrastructure that protects the integrity of its own processes. And I was surprised to read the description of the National Academy of Sciences process. And I'm wondering, Mr. Wiles, if you could comment on, is that unusual? What does it mean in terms of the credibility of the National Academy of Sciences? We've had members of my colleagues here today sort of throw out National Academy of Sciences as the good housekeeping seal of approval here. It had the National Academy of Sciences imprimatur. It must be legitimate. Are we to take some, should we take that with some skepticism under these circumstances? How do you put this into a larger context?
Well, I actually used to work at the National Academy of Sciences at the National Research Council managing these committees, and I can say from experience that the influence of the politics and that vested interests are having on the process now, I think, is unprecedented. What we cited in our testimony was an investigation that looked at public records from the White House that showed clear intervention in the process of selecting this committee by non-scientists within the White House. You had initially 3 industry consultants. One was actually a paid, someone who made a living as an expert witness in litigation. That person was ultimately removed. But what happens when you have industry consultants on these panels that have to reach a consensus finding is that finding is diluted in favor of the industry's interests, which typically are financial as opposed to public health. So it's a very serious problem. But that's just the NAS, the corruption of the NAS process, or the influence of the process, the influence of industry interest on the process is just a small part of the overall corruption of science that we've seen in this administration that I think was well documented last week in a hearing that was held before this committee. We've seen unprecedented levels of industry influence on every scientific panel and committee, from committees of the National Institutes of Health all the way through to committees at EPA that are all designed to, they're the first line of defense that the American public has against chemical pollution in the environment, and they've been in many respects taken over by the polluting industry under this administration.
Well, my time has expired, and I will end here, but it does remind me of the story about the 2 folks who are arguing over the merits of a particular debate. And one said to the other, you know, you can have your own opinion, but you don't get to have your own facts. And I think we're a little bit that way. You can have your own opinion, you can have your own policy outcome, but you shouldn't get to have your own science. That should be neutral. I appreciate thank you, Chairman.
Senator Barrasso.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Dr. Hoyle, if I could, you made a reference to in your testimony that this bill would compel an analysis within 180 days. And from a scientific standpoint, I mean, is that something that's reasonable to put a certain number of day limit? I think you had some concerns about that.
The reason I said I thought 180 days was a very short period was that the recommendations I was making about how to do a more scientifically credible job in this risk assessment process of carcinogens, EPA is going to have to do something a little different. And I also suggested that they try to bring in some peer reviewing during the process, advice from outside scientists and so on, so they'd come up with a credible product. Now, if you were to do that, which would be different from the way EPA has done things in the past, my guess is they could not pull it together in 180 days. You certainly probably wouldn't be able to get the quality advisors brought in, considering how long it takes to do Academy of Science committees and things of that sort.
Do you have any estimate on what the right time figure would be if you had to insert a time figure?
I really don't know. I was just sort of struck that if I had to arrange this from scratch with these changes, 180 days might have to cut some corners scientifically.
In your opinion, is there an immediate health risk that makes this bill necessary?
For TCE? Yeah. No. I think that if you look at the epidemiology, as the Academy had looked at, they talk about kidney cancer is the concern, and they have calculated very low risk levels for TCE based on the cancer studies, but the question is, these results are coming out of Germany, and there are some very high doses. Some of the workers got a continual dose of about 100 ppm of TCE in their work, with levels up to 400 to 500 ppm, and the study that they did use, the top doses were, I think, 1,000 ppm. And so there's a lot of uncertainty there, but these are very high doses, and they question whether, in fact, suggest they try to find some studies where you might have some lower doses that would intersect with that. There have been other studies, other epidemiological studies, say the one out of Denmark of the workers, TCE workers, where they measured TCE in the workers. They found no increase in kidney cancer. So it's kind of mixed.
Dr. Charnley, if I could, you said in your testimony that legislation compelling the EPA to regulate perchlorate would freeze a standard in place in reaction to politics, not really risk-based priorities, and essentially constitutes an environmental landmark and an earmark. Are you saying that such legislation, if passed, would basically be politics trumping science? Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, I think that the priority-setting process that is in place, courtesy of the Safe Drinking Water Act, is appropriate. I think that there is no imminent public health threat that means we should, regulate tomorrow. I think we probably should regulate, yes. But as long as, there is still some discussion about relative source contributions and various other issues underway, I think that process should, be completed.
And when you talked about the average exposure in the United States to perchlorate being about 1/10 of EPA's reference dose, are we really not? We're not talking about really protecting the average American, or are you just talking about pregnant women where the protection is needed, and what should we do there?
It's the pregnant women and the developing fetus who are the sensitive subpopulations, and I think that any regulation of perchlorate should take into account children's differences in exposure. There's no question about that. But I think that the studies of pregnant women, have not found any impacts of perchlorate exposure on either their hormone levels or on those of their offspring. And there are quite a number of recent studies that have looked at that, and I think should continue to look at that, of course. But I'm not convinced that there is a imminent public health threat.
Thank you. Madam Chairman, I think my time has expired. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Assemblywoman Lepardo, I was just talking to staff, and I'd read some of the earlier information for this hearing about how the GAO is, in fact, very critical about the delay that's going on with EPA and how much it has made it very difficult for local units of government and states to deal with this. Could you talk about the impact of waiting for too long in terms of the EPA acting and what you've had to do as a result of that?
Well, we have been really working around the edges of this. I mean, we've done the best we can to protect the individuals, the hundreds and hundreds of families and individuals in our community, waiting for the federal government to come to our rescue and aid, having our own health department resist us at every turn to provide a more restrictive standard. When we come to find out, and I'm looking at the GAO highlights summary as well, that a new IRIS process is being put in place that's going to delay this even further, I just don't even know how I'm going to go back and explain this to my constituents. I can appreciate what you were saying before about the 180 days. That may be too short of a time frame, perhaps, but we can't use this delaying tactic, it would seem, to further put my constituents at risk.
Thank you. And Mr. Wiles, just all the bills do is to require the EPA to use the best available science. Is that right?
That's correct.
And we have National Academy of Science reports on both TCE and perchlorate. And aren't we at risk of just reviewing this to death at some point?
We are, not to mention that we have the CDC study of 1,100 women, which I think is it's very unusual when you have the CDC with such a large study of exposure and adverse effects measured in the population just from ambient exposures that occur every day. And then under questioning from Republicans in the House on the Energy and Commerce Committee, the CDC was very clear that they feel that they do not need further research to support their finding, and that the finding is consistent with causality, which is about as strong a finding as you're ever going to get. So failing to act now with such strong evidence of exposure and harm is really unprecedented and completely unwarranted.
How would you describe, Mr. Wells, the extent of people's exposure to perchlorate in the United States, and in particular the exposure of infants and children?
Well, according to the CDC, it's ubiquitous. In other words, everyone is exposed. I think what we've heard today from earlier witnesses and what CDC research has shown that women of childbearing age are potentially at risk, and their developing babies are if they were to get pregnant due to exposures that the moms have. And then breast milk is also very highly contaminated, phenomenally highly contaminated based on what earlier witnesses said. So we've got a clear danger to the public health from a compound that we know how it acts. That it's not debated that perchlorate is toxic to the thyroid, that it interferes with normal thyroid function. So there literally is nothing left to do but act, and that's what this administration does not want to do.
And why do you think it's taken the EPA so long to create a perchlorate drinking water standard?
Well, the pressure's been clearly coming from the Department of Defense, the Air Force, and defense contractors. That goes back as early as 1962, when the first group was formed to investigate, to lobby, if you will, to pressure regulators into not acting to clean up groundwater supplies beginning in the 1960s. So there's at least 4, if not 5 decades of work on the part of DOD and contractors to avoid regulation, and it continues to this day. The difference with this administration is that this attitude of not protecting the public health is extended all the way to the EPA now, who has adopted the Defense Department line and the Lockheed Martin line that we don't need to act.
Last question, Mr. Wells. Do you support the bill that Senator Clinton and others have introduced to require the EPA to use available science to create drinking water standards and publicly available data for perchlorate, and to revise or create federal standards for TCE also using currently available data?
Absolutely. We support both bills, and we do believe that action by the Congress is clearly necessary to move this issue forward and to protect the public health.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Brasso? Okay, very, very good. I just want to thank our witnesses for coming. I would just point out that the GAO report is worth mentioning here in terms of their criticism of what's gone on here in terms of the delay. This is another government agency criticizing another government agency that we have waited for too long. As the testimony of Assemblywoman Lepardo shows, this is putting a great burden on local governments and state governments in a patchwork manner to deal with this. And the best thing that we could do would be to, as a country, would be if the EPA acted in this area. I believe I'm speaking on behalf of a number of, not all, but a number of the members of this committee, and we hope that this hearing will push this. And if that doesn't work, Congress, as we've said, is going to have to move forward with our legislation. Thank you very much, and this hearing's adjourned.